right. But delighted to have you here. I'm William Parsons. I'm Director of Global Irish Studies, and I teach in the English department here. The English department is co-hosting tonight's talk, as is physically the library. We're very grateful to the library for giving us this lovely room, which I don't know if anyone's been here recently, but it's had a makeover. These are new tables and new chairs, so it's quite fancy. The only thing about the library's makeover of this room that's very disappointing is that we found out that we're not allowed to have food or beverages. So imagine some cheese, because this is what we would normally do for you, but unfortunately the cheese is elsewhere right now. But we're very grateful to the library for their view. So I did explain to Karl that we'll all be looking out the window while he's talking. Tonight's talk is, as you can see, Ferdinand Levy, a Harlem Renaissance Dubliner and De-colonial Cosmopolitan. By Karl O'Hanlon, Dr. Karl O'Hanlon, who is a lecturer in Maynooth University in Ireland and graduated with his MA in English from Georgetown University in 2010. Yeah, in 2010. Sorry?
Say it quickly.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. He lectures in modern and contemporary poetry in Maynooth University, and he was here as a Fulbright scholar in 2008-2010. He has an article forthcoming on Levy, and this sounds fascinating. So we're getting basically a view into both that article, but also a BBC Radio 4 documentary that he is, would you call it producing? What do you describe when you're like
consulting?
Okay, all right, something to do with the BBC Radio 4 documentary. He is the principal investigator on a North-South research program project. The project is called BRAN, Beyond Regionalism and Nationalism in Irish Poetry. And his most recent writing can be found in Modernism Modernity, which is the sort of journal of record for modernist studies. And it is an article about the poet Dennis Devlin and 1930s broadcasting. And he's also written in the Irish Times, on Desmond Fitzgerald and T.S. Eliot. So Karl has been working on this area of 1930s, more or less 1930s, 1940s poetry for quite some time. And this is a slice out of I think a longer project, is it?
That's right. Yeah.
And this is not in his bio. I'm just this is just going to be a quiz here where I talk to Karl about things like that. Karl, you're very welcome. Really looking forward to it. Karl will speak for about 45 minutes-ish, and then we have time for questions. And again, please, pretend like you're getting up to get some food and beverage and whatever. Sorry about that, but all right, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Colleen. Yeah, it's a delight to be here. I just started with heart as I was coming around on the D3 bus from DuPont Circle and saw the places, and sort of honestly, it was again uncanny being back. It's a place it genuinely very dear to my heart. And 2 very happy years here.
I just want to check something, Karl. 1 second. Have we started the recording?
Yes.
I think they did earlier.
Yes, from another
Okay, all right, good. Sorry about that. Okay.
So, without further ado, this work on Ferdinand Levy, who's a Jamaican-born poet living and writing in Dublin in the 1930s and 40s, emerges out of a larger research project entitled Beyond Regionalism and Nationalism in Irish Poetry. Just going to see this slides. That doesn't seem to. Yeah. Thank you. So this project BRAN is a collaboration with Dr. Gail McConnell of Queen's University Belfast, and it's funded, I have to say this, by the North-South Research Programme. And in this project, we're trying to offer a new paradigm. I suppose it's a kind of old new paradigm. It's a synthesis, as you'll see when I describe it a little bit. We're thinking about culture and identity and cultural politics on the island of Ireland between 1920 partition and 1965, roughly speaking, but really we're sort of edging into the years before the Troubles. Like Bran, the voyager about legend, the project hoists anchor out of familiar narratives, away from the dominant critical narratives of Irish poetry in the period in which regionalism and nationalism operate as exclusive poles within a fractured and traumatized cultural scene. Nationalism and its discontents remains a vital theme within a variety of critical approaches to culture and post-coloniality, with an August roll call: James Dean, Gav Spivak, Edward Said, Tom Nairn, and Edward Longley, just some of those who, from very different positions, have grappled with the problematic of nationalism in all its manifest challenges and opportunities, and it maintains obviously a significance in recent de-colonial thought. Regionalism, which is the second part of our binary, might need a little bit more of an introduction, because it doesn't just refer to a territorial option relative to nationalism, but a distinct literary movement within mid-century poetry on the island of Ireland, with its basis in the poetry and criticism of this man, who some of you, anybody recognise him? It's not Roy McFadden who's mentioned there. It's John Hewitt, who was the senior poet or elder statesman of poetry in the north of Ireland in the generation preceding that kind of extraordinary generation of Seamus Heaney, Michael Longley, and Derek Mahon, and so on. So the most vociferous of that earlier generation, Hewitt was a Protestant poet born in Belfast with deep attachments within counties Antrim and Down. He was forged in the non-sectarian socialism of the 1930s and what his biographer affectionately calls old left earnestness. And his regionalism, rooted in the Northeast, has been perhaps unfairly dismissed as literary unionism, and it can only reductively be seen as a retreat, conservative retreat from his previous 1930 socialism in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Nevertheless, its influence, positively and negatively felt, has outweighed earlier, more discontinuous, more inchoate and surprising literary and political formations within Irish poetry. So Roy McFadden, who was a slightly younger poet of around similar era, took issue with both regionalism and Irish nationalism, writing in 1950, "Our roots travel widely and ignore boundaries and cultural and geographic units." And he in fact elsewhere described regionalism as a reactive mini-nationalism, and it's not a new insight to imagine Irish nationalism and forms of cultural unionism to make a shortcut there, as historically as well as conceptually mutually constitutive. Gail and I emerge out of we're children of the peace process, the two people that are doing this project. We're people who suffered, firsthand, really. We both lost family members. Gail, her father, and I lost a little bit further back. We had aunts and uncles, even back as far as the early 1920s. But rather than a kind of simple conceptual echo of the peace process, I suppose, the fundamental tendency of Brand's research is a recognition of sources of contradiction, exclusion, erasure, and possibility that binary narratives have demoted and overshadowed. There's a lovely quotation in Aimé Césaire's Discourses on Colonialism: "Extraordinary possibilities wiped out." And that's what we're interested in, these extraordinary possibilities that have been wiped out. It's that sense of suffocated itineraries that most exercises me, which nationalism and regionalism as cultural formations have done much to exacerbate. So Ferdinand Levy. Ferdy Levy lived for almost 2 decades in Dublin while studying medicine at Trinity College. His only book of poems, Flashes from the Dark, was published by Colm O'Loughlin's Three Candles Press in 1941. He eventually became a medical officer for the parish of St. James, Montego Bay in Jamaica, where he died in 1972. He lived in New York in the late 1920s, and he brought something of the Harlem Renaissance to Lower Baggot Street. You can imagine these two colliding bohemian energies in the 1930s and 40s. Senator John Harold Douglas at whose wedding Levy served as a groom, described his friend in an obituary in the Irish Times as a well-known personality in 1930s Dublin, patron of the arts, and a poet of no small merit. Columnists leave impressions of a trim, immaculate figure with long cigarette holder, an inveterate first nighter, quite a character in cosmopolitan Dublin. In his memoir, future Nigerian Health Minister Moses Majigodumni describes Levy as an Urban, affluent Jamaican who was president of the Association for Students of African Descent, or ASAD, in the period in which Majigodumni served as secretary. The overall image of Levy left by Dublin contemporaries is one of worldly charm, aesthetic enthusiasm, talent, and as well as this constant refrain of a young man of some financial means, which I find kind of interesting. He received favourable reviews from Austin Clarke, probably the kind of major poet in some ways of the generation immediately after Yeats, and other figures like Geoffrey Taylor, who's involved with the Bell, Temple Lane, an Irish woman poet, a pseudonym for an Irish woman poet who's recently been rediscovered, I should say. So despite all this, despite this positive reviews at the time, he's failed to garner even a footnote in Irish literary history. So I kind of wonder what dynamics are involved in the cultural amnesia of a well-known Jamaican acolyte of the Harlem Renaissance, active in the Dublin literary scene for 2 decades, and how might a recovery of his work aid our understanding of historical processes of othering which continue to shape contemporary Ireland. His poetry, as I say, was only 1 volume of poems, and I don't want to claim him as an overlooked Claude McKay or Langston Hughes. He was a young poet, and he was learning his craft. But he holds his own, I think, against other poets of the Harlem Renaissance. And he certainly holds his own against poets who have recently found new audiences, people like Francis Ledwidge, Breeden Lawton. I don't know if these names are, but they're names that are coming back through various forms of recovery in this past decade of centenaries, as it's been termed in Ireland, as questions of memory and exclusion rise once again to the fore. So what I want to suggest in the short span of this paper is that not only does the life of Ferdinand Levy as a Black poet and activist in mid-century Dublin critique a particular structure of systemic racism in 1930s and 40s Ireland, which is inseparable from a specific historically contingent post-colonial nationalism within global empire. So I kind of want to ask, in what ways is it contingent upon a contingent actual historical post-colonial nationalism that emerged in the aftermath of empire. Irish studies is only belatedly coming to terms with race with any degree of complexity, and there's been a steady trickle of scholarly works on race within Irish literary and cultural studies, much of it indebted to Paul Gilroy's idea of the stereophonic, bilingual, bifocal cultural forms of the African diaspora, and the idea of a Black Atlantic. There's the Black and Green Atlantic by Peter O'Neill and David Lloyd. And more recent work has tried to dismantle inadequately conflating crises of discrete experiences of post-colonialism and transnationalism. Obviously, the work that's ongoing in this studies program is part of that conversation. So I think it's interesting that 2 established Irish studies scholars have come to radically different conclusions about the relationship of Irish studies to race. And I want to keep these anonymous for now, because I'm not interested in the personalities. I'm interested in the arguments. So this is the first. Why is the mainstream of Irish studies so disconnected from or oblivious to where these political energies, complex arguments, and communities of solidarity are now gathering, now being fought, now coalescing? Several decades after its inauguration, does Irish studies itself need to be decolonized? And then second, after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement and the rise and fall of the Celtic Tiger, post-colonial studies, so the case ran, had failed to adapt to the complex realities of 21st century Irish life, and had thus been overtaken by more versatile forms of critique. Just as this truism was finding sanction, the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020, and the storm of Black Lives Matter protests that ran in tandem with campaigns to decolonize the Anglophone universities conspired to embarrass such assumptions. I let that sink in. So it's tempting to conclude that both these positions can't be right, that we have to choose. And I certainly prefer the questions of the first to the declaratives of the second. But it is worth maintaining, and being fair to the second voice, that the earliest waves of decolonial thought and critical thinking emerged in Harlem, and I've been looking at magazines in Ghana, Bombay, in the Library of Congress, Nigeria, Calcutta and elsewhere, looked to Ireland, and they looked to the example particularly of the Irish revival of Yeats's generation for points of orientation. And those anti-colonial solidarities are still alive and kicking in geopolitical terms. Decolonisation, one might say, isn't a metaphor. You know, to use Graham Opal's insistence, it isn't a metaphor. But be that as it may, just to take a slightly contrary view, clear thinking is a prelude to action. And Levy's poetry, I want to argue, embraces a form of decolonial cosmopolitanism. There is a kind of urgency to, I think, decolonize Irish studies with the first voice, or at least we might consider it. So his decolonial cosmopolitanism, as I'm calling it, is a critical attitude which mounts a challenge to nationalist tendencies within the mainstay of Irish post-colonial thinking then and now. And it's this attitude at the stance of Levy's poetry, its form, its vernacular, and its implicit politics that explains, for me, more than anything, his absence from literary history's mid-century poetry. So before I introduce his poetry, I just want to lay the ground for this idea of decolonial cosmopolitanism by introducing some other Black writers of the period who had Irish connections. Black poets and intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance looked to the Irish literary revival and Irish revolutionary politics for examples and correspondences, although seldom the other way around from what I've seen, was the compliment reciprocated. So for instance, Alian Locke's famous Harlem Renaissance seminal text, The New Negro, made favourable references to the revival. And in his early socialist journalism in London, Claude McKay, a Jamaican poet, concludes, "It is impossible not to feel that the Irish Revolution, nationalistic though it is an entering wedge directed straight to the heart of British capitalism." This isn't the straightforward compliment that it's sometimes been presented as in the past. McKay's membership of the Workers' Socialist Federation in London introduced him to the vanguard of the British left anti-colonialism, and these forms of international anti-colonial solidarity were deeply felt. In Winston James' excellent biography of the poet, the author notes that a ruthless new police force was established on the island of Jamaica following the peasant uprising, and that police force was directly modelled on the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the north of Ireland. Mingling with demonstrators at a Sinn Féin demonstration in Trafalgar Square in the summer of 1920, and enthusiastically greeted in his green necktie as, quote, Black Murphy and Black Irish, McKay later wrote an article for the Liberator, How Black Sees Green and Red. With both hands and my bag full of literature, I had to find time and a way for hearty handshakes and brief chats with Sinn Féin communists and regular Sinn Féiners. I caught a glimpse also of proud representatives of the Sinn Féin bourgeoisie. For that day, at least, I was filled with the spirit of Irish nationalism, although I am Black. What I find interesting is there's seldom then any sense of disidentification of discreetly racialized experiences of colonialism. Indeed, there are entire articles written without discrimination, racism whatsoever. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but it's just something I think to be honed in on. For all that he claimed to be filled with the spirit of Irish nationalism, McKay's anti-colonial solidarity with the revolutionaries was complicated. And this is from a letter he wrote in 1924. We say white versus black, but we know that it's more than that. The Irish and Indian peoples hate the English nation because they visualize it as the power oppressing them. It is only from that point of view that their nationalist movement is at all tenable, because when we look at facts, we find many members of the English nation working for Irish and Indian independence. And it is thus also with Negroes. The whites en masse represent a system that oppresses Negroes, but it is a system that a great body of thinking whites were accidentally born into and would like to change. But it isn't an easy matter. And in the common fight, we use the ordinary phrases, black versus white and working class versus bourgeoisie, that are not at all correct for life that's narrow and definite like that. So this is one mood, and in other moods, he chides the English leftists for deriding those anti-colonial nationalist movements, certain that they would develop beyond a bourgeois phase. He was able, despite occasions of racism, to maintain anti-colonial sympathies with Sinn Féin's revolutionaries, while also acknowledging the racist refrain that you might have heard, that Ireland was, quote, the only last white nation to under the yoke of foreign imperialism. It's John Mitchell is the nationalist thinker most associated with that particular phrase, but Arthur Griffith drew on it. Dubliner mentioned it once, and in a surprising way, I think. So in his own words, Mackay found it comforting to think that bourgeois nationalists and patriots of whatever race or nation are all alike in outlook. They chafe under the foreign bit because it prevents them from using to the full of their native talent, to exploit their own people. So to my mind, Mackay's probing questions of reification and reaction that haunt identity politics, as it's sometimes called, nearly a century ahead of us, even as he suggests that these ordinary phrases, the strategic essentializations, are ways of naming colonialism, racialization, and that they're necessary. Now, some of these nuances and ambiguities prepare the ground for Levy's poetry and thought, but there are differences. This is the first phase of revolution. This is 1920. By the time Levy arrives in Dublin in late 1932, the Irish state has entered its second decade. Power has been transferred to Fianna Fáil, the Dubliner's party, that would enjoy uninterrupted government until the late 1940s. And despite relatively progressive stirrings in some directions, social housing, and ultimately an effectual voice within the League of Nations, the Dubliner dispensation was, as we know, clericalized, misogynistic, and conservative as the Free State Common Gael government before it. So in other words, Levy comes to Ireland at precisely the moment or phase of post-colonialism, which Aimé Césaire memorably described as a kind of premature decadence or senility. The national bourgeoisie of the colonial countries, writes Césaire, is already senile before it has come to know the petulance, the fearlessness, and the will to succeed of youth. So compared to these kind of earlier revolutionary points of contact, Levy's writing and thought really only affords much less space to selectively engage with forms of solidarity and identification without concerning racialization, racism, and Eurocentrism as modalities within anti-colonial struggle. So Ferdy Levy was born in Jamaica in 1904. His father Cecil is described as a clerk in his matriculation records. There's this constant refrain that he was financially comfortable. And in the late 1920s, he lived in New York, where he was involved in the cultural flowering of the Harlem Renaissance. And during this period, he was connected with this man, L.S. Alexander Gumby, who was the founder of the Gumby Book Studio Group, whose members are infrequent passage through included Langston Hughes and County Cullen and others. He was an inveterate scrapbooker, he was a socialite, he was gay, rare book collector, and the book club survived until the crash, really. Its financial support dried up in the crash. It was a venue for Black modernism and political emancipation. Levy also contributed to its short-lived Quarterly, which was an ill-fated magazine that arrived in 1930, just around the time of the crash when the studio had to wind up. And the galleys of this first issue described the studio as, quote, a veritable shrine of Negro greatness, and the editorial proposes that the artists, musicians, and poets based around the studio constitute a specific, significant interracial coterie. So some of the figures involved included Arthur A. Schomburg, whose collection forms the base of the Schomburg Center in Harlem, the writer and painter Richard Bruce Nugent, and writer and commentator George Schuler. They were the kind of nucleus of it, along with Levy and Gumby himself. And this is just a kind of a juvenile poem from that period, the Caribbean. And it's very different to the Black Vernacular of the poems in the 1941 collection. Well, I've seen the Caribbean in all her wild and raging forms, and I've seen her often when her soul was quiet, and her ways were gentle, and her manner serenely calm, like a Madonna. He republished this poem in the collection, a kind of redemption song, turning over different aspects of diasporic longing. Music, rather than literature, was the central enthusiasm of Levy's Harlem days. He was friendly with two musicians, Leviticus Lyon and Hall Johnson, who he dedicated the book of poems to. Lyon was a singer and choral director who had performed at Carnegie Hall and co-founded the Negro Symphony Orchestra and lived in Harlem until his death in 1958. And Paul Johnson was a composer and arranger of African-American spirituals who also contributed music to the Disney films, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Dumbo. According to the dedication, Johnson was Levy's earliest and most constructive literary critic, while Lyon first stimulated his artistic and musical tastes, and it's Lyon that he's corresponded with most frequently. In October 1932, Levy moved from New York, boarded a ship bound for Liverpool with the intention of studying medicine, and he initially considered Edinburgh, Queen's University Belfast, before settling on Trinity College Dublin. And what we know of Levy from that period is mainly contained within newspapers, his correspondence with Leviticus Lyon, and his poetry. The dedication in the book describes his Dublin years as a most delightful episode, and he formed lifelong friendships there. At the same time, racism was an everyday occurrence. In particular, access to housing is one that crops up again and again, that landlords were discriminating on the basis of race. A sadly perennial feature of a very dysfunctional housing market in Ireland. So outside poetry, his interests in extracurricular activities were diverse. He had a keen interest in the visual arts, and he was a collector of modernist paintings. So he sat for Louis Le Brocq, one of Ireland's foremost painters, who was renowned for his interest in writers' subjects. He painted Beckett, probably his most famous painting of Beckett. He painted, as one of his earliest paintings, I think it's an extraordinary painting actually, 1939. It's one of his first works. And the study for it, the kind of pencil sketch for it, then became an illustration in Levy's book of poems. So Levy wasn't only a sitter, he was a collector. He collected Le Brocq, he collected Mamie Jellett, Paul Henry, modernists and traditional paintings. He had a kind of remarkable art collection. He was also the co-founder with an Irish civil servant, Francis Kelly, of the Dublin Gramophone Society, first gramophone society in Ireland, where they would basically put on a music hall event. They would have records, and it was a kind of form of social gathering and entertainment. So this is just a description of one of these events. In the soft light of the open fire, flickering grotesque shadows against the canvas on the walls, impeccable host Levy plays from his enormous collection of records. A connoisseur, he possessed the best recordings of any music on earth, from Beethoven to Negro spirituals, on which he has a unique collection. Keen as he is on the art of his race, his small brown hand, be it to be a surgeon's, glides with an electric lamp as thin as pencil along the hundreds of records in their racks. The evenings he gives for his friends are of rare relaxation, of old world charm, the world's culture at its best, in the Dublin home of this Jamaican. According to Quidnunc, who's the ebullient third Baron Levy, Patrick Campbell. You might have seen him. I don't know if he used to be on a very popular TV show. The name escapes me right now, but Levy's collection of records was one of the best in the country, and a lot of music is concerned of a lot of his poetry. Levy's involvement, by comparison with the Dublin literary scene, only gathered pace after the publication of his 1941 book of poems. But in the 30s, he did recite poetry at social events, including the house of Senator James Douglas, and he came to know A.E., the poet and painter George Russell, who corresponded with him and critiqued some of his poems in his home. He used to visit him in his home in Rathgar shortly before he died. Prior to the publication of this book of poems, he doesn't appear to have published much in Dublin. There is a poem in the Trinity College magazine. I haven't been able to find it, but it's claimed that it's there somewhere. But he did publish one poem after, at least one that I found. And this is in a kind of scandalously bohemian outfit called the Runa Quartos. They kind of operated, I suppose, a polycule or a kind of menage a cinq in Monkstown in the 1940s. They lived and they had kind of free love in the 1940s. Ethna and Rupert Strong were the founders of this magazine. And this is a poem, Harlem Depression, that features in that 1943 magazine. So he alludes here to Irish-American racism, but he publishes it in an Irish magazine. And this perhaps draws attention to those kind of strange complicities. The idea, I know it's a controversial idea, but the idea that Noel Ignatieff has put forward of the Irish becoming white, etc., and I put that in quotation marks. But also this idea of racialized state violence that is not merely, or it's hinted that it's not merely a problem of Ireland's diaspora. In addition to poetry, theatre and music, Levy's commitments in Dublin included student activism and attempts to forge race consciousness and de-colonial consciousness. So throughout the 1930s and 40s, he was involved in the Association for Students of African Descent, ASAD. Members included Nigerian statesmen, some leading ENT specialists, prize-winning surgeons based in Harlem then as well, Trinidadian Earl Thompson and others. This photograph, and I'd say more on this maybe in the Q&A, just because I'm conscious of time, shows the singer Paul Robeson, who visited Ireland in the mid-1930s. Robeson, an activist, a socialist, and it was taken in Levy's flat. I'm not sure if he's there, I don't know. I suspect he is the man in the middle row profile, but it's not a good, I don't have enough pictures of him to actually be able to identify him. I just have the sketches and very, very grainy photos from the Irish Times. But certainly it was taken in his flat where they entertained Robeson, and I'd say maybe more about that because it's quite an interesting episode after. Assad held meetings with talks on racial justice, the expropriation of land in Kenya by white settlers. They delivered broadcasts on Radio Ireland, and they fundraised. And one of the closest collaborators with them was a senator. He later became a senator. He was the son of a senator himself, John Harold Douglas, who was the founder of an overseas student society. In August 1935, at the height of the Abyssinia crisis, they went to government buildings to petition De Valera directly. And they met De Valera on several occasions, I believe, and were, according to at least one, well received. And a poem from that period emerges in the collection on, entitled The Rape of Ethiopia, which links Mussolini's invasion to previous colonial conquests. The last stronghold of all black men is now devoured by the whites. The pretext is not as when the French and British robbed our rights. So, in other words, this isn't the specious imperial justifications of the white man's burden, it's naked threat. And later in the poem, the bubbling wrath of Pasha Turd wafts down in mustard gas, and Levy urges leading Africa and Pan-African mobilization from Cape to Dakar to avenge the Roman wound. So it's a kind of activist poem about Mussolini's fascist invasion of Ethiopia. With more intensity than Claude McKay or other Harlem Renaissance writers, Levy was keen to analyse the structure of Irish and Black post-coloniality in a critical rather than merely a sympathetic spirit. In a letter to Lyon, he draws out what the Black race have to learn from the Irish. Quote, they really do enjoy themselves at a dance, the tango, the Paul Jones, the old-fashioned waltzes and what have you, complete abandonment. I find the Irish race just waking up, as from a long sleep, and gradually coming to realise that they are free from the harsh master's yoke, England. They are now running rampant with nationalism. Ireland for the Irish, buy Irish goods, our Irish spirit, and a lot of other such tripe. Whether or not this will be successful is doubtful, not in this age when the entire world yearns for unity. If the movement is making any headway, I have yet to be convinced. This is a decolonial thinker, right? But it's a brand of anti-colonial or decolonial politics that refutes simplistic exchanges. And he's particularly wary of nationalism as the focal ideological engine of Irish post-colonial identity. It's there everywhere in the 30s, right? It informs the parafascism of the blue shirts on the one hand. If you look at like really tiny left-wing socialist Republican magazines, they're also draping the Starry Cloud, the socialist symbol, in green. You know, it's there and it's unavoidable. Racism, obviously, is a part of why he comes to this conclusion. Overt and subtle, it was an everyday occurrence. In Belfast, he says, I was stared at like some damn curio. In Dublin, children heard racial abuse, men made threatening gestures, and staring was typical. He writes to Lyon, you can sum up the stares in this way: for the girl's admiration and desire for sexual tryouts, for the child your curiosity, for the men a feeling of resentment and a fear that their women will become too intimate with you. So more than 20 years before Frantz Fanon would write Black Skin, White Masks, Levy's letters probe racialized white supremacist sexual anxieties that he encountered in Dublin within a culture that had an already fraught relationship with sex. And he comes to that in a poem as well called Down in Connell Street. I'll just let you read. This isn't the whole poem, it's just an excerpt. So the main shopping thoroughfare, this kind of central artery of Dublin, he writes this poem about it. A poem so extraordinary, and I think, or at least unusual, that one wonders how it escaped the all-seeing glare of Irish censorship. It turns that thoroughfare into an arena for this supremacist sexual neurosis. So the woman smiles at Levy. The smile she smiled was indiscreet. And then it finishes with this explosive revision of the refrain, which isn't quite like anything else in Irish poetry of the period. I make her know that tropic love is sweet. Lord, no, not down in Connell Street. So these experiences in his letters, his poems, etc., grate against the view that racism is merely an aggregation of prejudices, rather than, as has been argued by critical race theorists, a structural issue. And if a mid-century Irish context requires nuance and distinction from a British one or an American one, it certainly does, it's precisely in that context that it takes on its structural tendencies. So John Brannigan, who's written on this, writes, racial ideologies and racist expressions within modern Irish culture since 1922 have been merely overlooked as secondary or belated signifiers of an effectively redundant colonial interpretive regime. Aspects of Irish racism were inevitably inherited and recharged or discharged along colonial lines, but they were also products of what Brannigan calls the specific historical conditions, forms, and effects of racial ideologies and racist expressions within Irish culture. I've been aside, I might come back to, I'm just conscious, I thought I might have a little bit longer, so I want to keep to time if I can. But I might come back to an aside about a recent viral video featuring a young Black Irishman and a member of the Irish far right, which I think kind of maybe illustrates the point I'm getting at here. In 1940, Levy gave a paper, The Irish Theatre as Seen by a Foreigner, to the Philosophical Society in Trinity College, Dublin, and in it he decried racist caricatures on stage. And this is Levy's first quotation. Foreigners did not go to the theatre to be complimented, but they did not go there to be insulted. And then in response, the vice president of the association, P.T. Montford, any offensive shows on the stage here had not their origin in Dublin or Ireland, right? Which completely overlooks first the appetite for some of these stage minstrel shows, but also the fact that there were productions of Emperor Jones and so on that were put on, by the Abbey, etc. Another respondent was this gentleman on your right, Ernest Blythe, who is depicted here in blue shirt uniform, leading intellectual light of the blue shirt movement, a far right organisation which flared and dissipated in the mid-1930s. It was not the business, Blythe wrote, of Irish dramatists to present only a picture of Irish life that would give a good impression to foreigners. So you have Blythe's xenophobia, you have Montford's more subtle, reflexive desire to disown Irish racism, but they're twin manifestations of mid-century Dublin attitudes to racial prejudice, which could be insidious. So Dr. Cormac Bravena, who's the Lord Mayor of Dublin, minimised anti-Black racism in Ireland. He told a gathering of ASA, the student movement, quote, many of whom wore picturesque African costume, that the church to which he belonged knew no racial barriers. We, like you, have suffered a good deal from foreign domination. We in this country have freed ourselves in a way that Africa has yet to achieve. The north of Ireland, first of all, is strikingly absent in this summary. And interracial solidarity here is what Denise Riley has called illusory centres, the seeming results of a consensus where no one was ever consulted. It's a well-intentioned attempt to grow towards solidarity, but in some ways it is also the reverse of that familiar lament that Ireland was, quote, the last white nation without freedom. So Dublin post-colonialism marks over Irish white universalism. And I'm coming to the end of the paper. Grant Bannon, in his essay, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, insisted in The Wretched of the Earth. History teaches us clearly that the battle against colonialism does not run straight away from the lines of nationalism. The native bourgeoisie will fight to the bitter end against those who, quote, insult our dignity as a nation. The fact is, such action will become more and more tinged by racism. From nationalism we have passed to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism. Nor have these subtle manoeuvres gone away. Ronan Lenton argues that a disavowal of the pain of immigration, in her view, lies behind the refusal to countenance the plight of asylum seekers in what's known as direct provision centres in Ireland, and the racialisation through Irish racism, the recent phenomenon, which you may be aware of Irish ethno-nationalists cynically applying the rhetoric of plantation. They use this term, the idea of plantation, state-sponsored early modern colonisation to asylum seekers and refugees, or indeed a narrative that's more familiar here, the Irish slave myth. I'm sure you've come across in some shape or form, that's been propounded by the alt-right and so on. So while still comparatively small in Ireland, the far right harness some of these structural appeals that I've been outlining, and a recent novel that's been bigger shortlisted, Paul Lynch's Prophet Song, is a kind of chilling look at how quickly these political formations can be articulated and assembled. So these kind of perennial dynamics make of Levy, a poet who's been absent from the narratives, a kind of uncanny return of the repressed. His situatedness as a cosmopolitan Jamaican in Dublin via Harlem is important to grasping the particulars of his contribution to Irish literature and his specific contribution to anti-colonial discourse within it, which refuses to flatter or to conform to Irish nationalist ideas of colonialism. By cosmopolitan, I probably should have spelled out a lot earlier. I mean a rehumanizing critical cosmopolitanism, such as Frantz Fanon exhibits here. The idea of a new humanism for itself and others, in which cultural exchange is oxygen, and in which non-Europe has influenced Europe, if only we can excavate the bundles of silence that are involved. I'm just coming to the end. Gopal writes, decolonizing requires that we remain vigilant about decolonizing the term's misuse as an alibi for renewed subjugation. Césaire notes correctly that it is not the anti-colonialist who desires a simple return to a pre-colonial past, but colonialism itself, which has actually tended to prolong artificially the survival of local pasts in their most pernicious aspects. This means a return to any state of what existed before colonialism, stripping away the colonial to achieve a recuperation of the pre-colonial or even the decolonial, and to segregate cultures and knowledges is a self-defeating project. In terms of Irish studies, Irish literary history, the obscurity of early Levy's poetry renders visible the ways in which migrant writing, decoloniality, cosmopolitan entanglements, and racialized writers have erstwhile been ghosts at the post-colonial feast. Thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just writing down a question there, but I won't ask that question. I will throw it open to all of you. I think we'll be okay. Actually, I think we'll be okay using that. Yeah, you can hold on there, and then that'll record. Open to you for questions. I have a million, but I'll keep it to myself for a few minutes. Yeah.
What do you think of the inclusion of race in the movie The Crying Game, which I think was Forrest Whitaker as a black actor in it, and that was quite early on, but you know, race was quite a big feature of it. What are your thoughts on that?
It's been a long time since I have seen it, but it's years and years ago, so I'd be bluffing if I tried to give you an answer to it. I can't remember. I'll go away and rewatch it though, because I misremembered that. But I don't know, unfortunately. I can't think off the top of my head.
One thing that I found interesting was in that letter, I think it was to Lion, on the slide where you talked about decolonial ideas. This concept of referring to the Irish as a race, and in the broader context of racism and racism that Levy experienced, do you think this was more of a colloquialism and referring to just the Irish people, or do you think that there was a broader idea of the Irish as a specific race inside of a broader white identity?
The answer is, I think he's thinking and groping towards a language, as Claude McKay does, I think, with a lot more forensic precision, about what racialization is like. And he, to my mind, he understands fully that there are post-imperial solidarities here, there are anti-colonial solidarities here, but he feels a withdrawal or a risk in nationalism and the form that it's taken, which Frantz Fanon finds later. Frantz Fanon describes basically what he is attuned to, if that makes sense. Frantz Fanon theorizes the idea of a certain type of Eurocentric post-colonial Irish nationalist racism. So he's not saying, I suppose, that the Irish haven't been racialized in some ways. We know, like if we read our history, that they were. Edmund Spencer writes, "The Fairy Queen is full of it." Right? So, in that moment, it's very much a thing. But racialization doesn't always run in one direction, and he's attuned, as he say, to this risk of nationalism because he's experiencing its effects negatively. As did most Irish people who lived under it in the period. You know, as you say, it was something that it inhibited, in my view, you know, because I'm interested in other figures like, you know, socialists who were looking for their type of their culture, a kind of small forgotten culture within Irish literature, Irish socialists of the 1930s. They also had to kind of navigate nationalism. Sometimes that meant, often it meant not a confrontation, it often meant a form of accommodation. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I don't think, I don't know, because the 1930s, I don't know enough necessarily about the language here, whether he's thinking of it in a very monolithic, concrete, sort of real, reified way. I don't think he is the way he's using the language. And certainly Claude McKay is very much attuned to the fact that it's nonsense, right? That it's historical, that it's a form of taxonomy that's been invented and went hand in hand with colonialism.
You mentioned that AE had reviewed some of his poetry. I was wondering if you could talk about like what that was like what was his position towards Levy?
So Austin Clarke reviewed him in the Irish Times and wrote quite positive review in which he also bashes Louis MacNeice into smithereens in the same review. So that's kind of interesting, actually. I mean, there are some kind of words that jump out of Austin Clarke's review, like antics, and there's kind of, you know, there's stuff going on there too. AE corresponded with him as a kind of junior poet before the book came out. So AE died, I think, around 1938 or 9, off the top of my head. He went out to Rathgar, to a salon, and they conversed. And he felt that his poetry fell between two stools in a way. And I suppose probably wanted him to lean into more the Black vernacular that he ultimately adopted. Because some of the poems that are included in that volume, which I didn't show, are kind of strange. I don't know how to describe them, but they're almost like pastiches of Milton. They're kind of strange sonnets that have an Augustan flavour to them. He pastiches the ballad. So there is a kind of stylistic discontinuity that I find really interesting, actually. So AE was clearly saying you need a voice. And I think he was getting there, but he didn't publish really after this. He published this one book of poems. He left Ireland in 1948, did a medical degree from 1938 to 1948 because a professor refused to give him a particular course because of racism, according to his daughter. That's what she imagines. So he had to go somewhere else to get it. So it meant he was there for the best part of 2 decades.
You promised to talk to us about the photograph.
Oh yeah. So the photograph's interesting because Assad attended a performance, I think at the Abbey. I don't know quite the years because Robeson came twice in the 1930s, first in 1935. And they had planned to protest. So they just occupied different parts of the theatre and they booed him because they felt that he perpetuated racial stereotypes. He was dismayed and horrified by this. He went and sought them out after the show. They went back to Levy's flat in Margaret Street, and he basically talked to them about the fact that he was, as a wee bit, an anti-colonialist and a committed activist as they were, and they parted on good terms. But there's nothing more about that occasion. It's literally what I've said to you. There's no other extra nugget. I'd love to know. There's no records for this student society. We've reams of the Lit Deb or Lit Hist in Trinity, which Levy was a member of, as well as the Philosophical Society, but there are no records for Assad for whatever reason. So yeah, it's an interesting moment as well of kind of solidarities and perceptions. And Levy also writes very interestingly about the kind of tensions between, for instance, the students from Africa and the students from the Caribbean and the students from elsewhere. So there's a kind of interesting sort of intergroup working out of problematics as well. along the lines of nationalism, Pan-Africanism, transnationalism, what's thought about that as well?
You'll look at me as if I have questions. 2 weeks ago, we had Morris Casey here, talking about pretty much the same decade, pretty much the same kind of story about Americans who moved to Ireland in the 1920s, late 1920s into the 1930s, who hung out with AE. So AE turned up a lot 2 weeks ago in terms of the guest. And we're part of a very clearly close-knit scene involving Baggot Street, so this sort of cosmopolitan part of Dublin. And just to, I mean, your phrase "suffocated itineraries" is really interesting, right? So there are all of these itineraries that have been suffocated within a kind of a larger nationalist history. And I guess I wanted to ask you or invite you to think a little bit more about what this work that's now happening is telling, and why this work is happening now, of finding these migrants to Ireland in the 1920s and 1930s, whom, who obviously somebody knew about, and they're hanging out with AE, but why this work is happening now, excavating these suffocated itineraries of people arriving in Ireland and who they spoke to, what they did, what kind of impact they had.
That's a really good question, and I'm sure there's not just one answer to it. I suspect that it emerges out of a sense of that planetary consciousness that I think is really there, that is urgent and feels necessary. When I put up the two quotations from the two leading Irish studies scholars, it wasn't in any sense trying to denigrate either of the positions. I think they're valid positions. I kind of hesitating were the questions first. The second was of its moment, and it was important and it was urgent. And I think strategically, politically, in terms of what's asked of us as citizens or as human beings on Earth, when I look at Ireland and I look at what's happening elsewhere in Europe, there's a kind of urgency, I think, to do this. Priya Gopal's been really at the forefront of my view, for my money, on really thinking about what it means to decolonize universities. She doesn't snort as gladly in doing that. But nationalism is one of the kind of themes that she wants to really unpick, because she's looking at the particular context that interests her in India with BJP. So I think there's a kind of strategic urgency about it in the present political moment, and as you say, the planetary moment. And I'm looking back and saying that, like, we're more than a diaspora, and we're more than the sum of this kind of movement, as great as that is, and as kind of interesting as it is, that it wasn't just that way, that Ireland has been enriched for centuries back to kind of the Milesians or the Spanish, that there's been this kind of enrichment going on, and we need to think a little bit more about that. And I'm at the kind of, I'm really ignorant of it. I don't know, like, for instance, I only know the names involved in Morris's work, but Morris has been one of the at the forefront of this, I think.
Maybe that connects to, and then I'll let you sit down. That might connect to the other thing you told us you would talk about in questions, which is a very contemporary moment of an interaction.
So, I mean, I haven't fully formed my opinion on this, but it just occurred to me as I was writing the paper. There was a viral moment on social media a couple of weeks ago of a young Black Irish socialist confronting an Irish ethno-nationalist, one of these kind of leading voices of the far right. And they were both filming one another, as happens in these confrontations. And the socialist spoke to the far right agitator in Irish, and the far right member couldn't speak back in Irish Gaelic. And I thought that's really interesting, because I suppose I worry about that a little bit because of problems of the good immigrant. I have no problem with, like, I wish I could my folk club, but that's about it. I don't speak Irish. but I worry about the kind of the sense of the virality. One, yeah, it was a racist getting their comeuppance, but the kind of way that's articulated, I find a little bit troubling. That there's this idea that you're kind of on perpetual probation as the descent. As, in this case, like second or third generation, I think. Immigrant. There's the good immigrant or the good. This idea. So I was kind of a bit interested in it. As you say, that's not the only way of looking at it. But I find it slightly problematic, and I thought about what that means in terms of nationalism. And nationalism is again this kind of de-colonial engine. So there was a solidarity being extended by the way it was being retreated, and so on. There was a sense of anti-colonial solidarities. There's also something that's kind of conservative and reactionary about it that made me think. So I hope that articulated that well enough. But yeah, I still want to think a bit about it. But my initial instinct was I'm not on board with this. I don't know that I like where this energy of approval is coming from. Yeah.
Other questions? Thoughts, comments, arguments?
Yeah, I was just wondering, how did you get interested in this? Why are you
I
doing
love
this?
poetry, and I came across. I have two heads, and one is a kind of old-fashioned, dyed-in-the-wool formalist, which is kind of tragic, and then the other, I suppose, is a kind of bloodhound for archives, and the two things just come together. I love poetry, and I like when poetry has a degree of historic import or urgency in the way Yeats's does. And so when I find this poetry, I instantly connected with like a narrative that's completely occluded in these little magazines, and there's so many of them. Some of them socialist, some of them bohemian, that are just forgotten about, and they are being recovered. But it was just the kind of thrill of then tracking him down and finding out little bits and pieces. So the Lion letters are in Yale, but they're there. But he's never been written about, and he's a sort of, to me, I'm bored you to tears, but a fascinating character. I think he's just a really interesting figure. I wonder where he would have went as a poet, actually, if he published beyond the first collection.
Are you a poet too?
I do, for my sins.
Hoping to be discovered 100 years. 100 years from now. Sorry.
Louis McNeese's minor poets.
That's probably a good question on which to end, because I was thinking the same thing. I was also thinking there are many obscure poets. There are many poets who published one book in the 1930s or 1940s, and I was wondering why this one was the one that you came to. But I think you give an excellent account of this being to use that phrase from the literary critic Raymond Williams, a poet that gives us access to a structure of feeling of a particular time that has been occluded, that has been hidden, an idea beyond just fascists and blue shirts and whatever, but of this particular kind of cosmopolitan life being lived in Dublin in the 1930s. So in that sense, it spoke very well to Maurice Casey's work that I know many of us were at a couple of weeks ago. So can we thank Karl very much for and again, I'm gonna apologize that we can't offer you a glass of wine, but those are the library rules. We should all go stand outside the library and have some wine, but we should end this recording somehow. So, yeah.